Welcome to 1189, an online Bible commentary. My name is Tyler Marston, and today we're taking a look at Leviticus chapter 2. In the first chapter, we explored burnt offerings, sacrifices that were given to God to atone for sin and to show trust in Him. In this chapter, we'll see instructions given for grain offerings, and these were normally used to show gratitude and thankfulness for God's provision. The symbols and instructions in this chapter remind us that we should be giving our best to God, and we should be doing so sober-mindedly without reservation. Now, when anyone presents a grain offering as an offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. He shall then bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and shall take from it his handful of its fine flour and of its oil with all of its frankincense. And the priest shall offer it up in smoke as its memorial portion on the altar, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. So in addition to the instructions for the burnt offerings of animals, the Israelites also had instructions on how to sacrifice their grain and basically their crops to God. These grain offerings were usually made up of fine flour mixed with oil and aromatics. It was a way to say thank you to God for His provision, giving Him back the food that He had given them. We remember that all the way back in Genesis 4, Abel, the shepherd, gave his sheep, and Cain, the farmer, gave his harvest. They each gave what God had blessed them with. And it wasn't that one was better than the other. It all comes from God, and we should thank Him for whatever He has given us. The problem between Cain and Abel was that Abel offered the best he had, and Cain only gave half-heartedly. And then when God had favor on Abel's offering, Cain got jealous. But we'll see a little bit more of that later. For right now, we see that these grain offerings are covered in oil and also burned on the altar. The remainder of the grain offerings belong to Aaron and his sons, a thing most holy of the offerings to the Lord by fire. The portion of the grain offerings that weren't burnt on the altar were to be given to the priests. These would end up in the offerings of the showbread, described in Exodus 25. That was the sacred bread that sat on the table in the tabernacle before God's presence at all times. But it would also go on to be provision for the priests themselves. Their full-time job was to take care of the tabernacle and all of the sacrifices. They weren't able to grow their own food or grains. God was providing for the priests through stirring the hearts of the people towards sacrifice. Verses 4 through 10 describe different grain offerings that were baked before they were burnt on the altar. The dough would have to be unleavened, made of flour and oil, and it would either be baked on a griddle or in a pan. And these kind of wafers would end up being broken, covered in oil, and offered on the altar, just like the offerings of the raw flour would be. No grain offering, which you bring to the Lord, shall be made with leaven, for you shall not offer up in smoke any leaven or any honey as an offering by fire to the Lord. So this is an interesting detail, and in our culture, we don't really get the symbolic significance of leaven or honey and why they were outlawed from being sacrificed with the grain offerings. The reason there was no leaven was a tie back to Exodus 12 and the Passover story. After the Passover, the Israelites were in a hurry to leave Egypt. They didn't have time to sit around and wait for their bread to proof, so they brought it with them unleavened. Offering unleavened bread was a way to remember God's deliverance in the past and to remember the haste with which we should chase after Him in His presence. The grain offerings were also prohibited from having any honey mixed into them. Honey in the Old Testament often has the same symbolic significance as something like wine. That's because the fermentation of grapes into wine and honey into mead have been around since ancient times. So honey is a symbol of God's abundant blessing. It's why the Promised Land was called a land of milk and honey in Exodus 3 and 13. But it also has ties to stories of sin and moral failure, like Samson in Judges 14 or Saul in 1 Samuel 14. It was important to be sober and solemn when making these sacrifices to God, which might be the reason why honey was prohibited from these offerings. As an offering of first fruits, you shall bring them to the Lord, but they shall not ascend for a soothing aroma on the altar. Every grain offering of yours, moreover, you shall season with salt, so that the salt of the covenant of your God shall not be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. So here we get instructions that the grain offering should be made up of the first fruits of a harvest. The first fruits were the crop that came up first out of all of the seed you had planted. They were considered the best of the harvest in this culture, and it was a sign that you trusted in God's provision to provide more. That creates another tie to the Cain and Abel story in Genesis 4, where Abel gave the firstlings of his flock, but Cain did not give the first fruits of his harvest. On top of that, we hear that the grain offering should be seasoned with salt, a symbol of the preservation of God's covenant with his people. Salt goes on to be a famous image used in Jesus' ministry in places like Matthew 5 and Mark 10, displaying followers of God, those who were in that covenant with him, to be the preservation of purity and holiness in the world. Verses 14 through 16 are the final verses of this chapter. They deal with grain offerings that are made from heads of grain as opposed to ground up flour. And again, it shows that anyone can sacrifice to God, whether you have access to a mill or not. The instructions given are that it should also be from early in the harvest, and it should also be crushed up, mixed with oil, and burnt on the altar. The symbolism of the grain offerings shows that reconciliation with God is more than just a sin debt being paid and then everybody going back to business as usual. It's about gratitude and thankfulness, recognizing God as the true provision for everything in our lives. As a result, we should be willing to offer up the best of what we have to Him. Now, obviously, us in America, we probably don't have very much grain to offer to God, but we can still offer the best of our time, of our money, our resources. Jesus gave His life for us. So we should be willing to lay down our lives and our desires, our ambitions to follow Him. Thanks for watching 1189. I hope you have a good day, and God bless.